Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Zoraida Córdova to discuss The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, published by our friends at Atria Books. Zoraida Córdova is the acclaimed author of more than a dozen novels and short stories, including the Brooklyn Brujas series, Star Wars: Galaxy's Edge, A Crash of Fate, and The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina. In addition to writing novels, she is on the board of We Need Diverse Books and is the co-editor of the best-selling anthology Vampires Never Get Old, as well as the co-host of the writing podcast Deadline City. She also writes romance novels as Zoe Castile. Zoraida was born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and calls New York City home. When she's not working, she's roaming the world in search of magical stories. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are joined by Victoria V.E. Schwab, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than 20 books. Her work has received critical acclaim, been translated into over 24 languages, and optioned for television and film. When she's not haunting Paris streets or trudging up English hillsides, she lives in Edinburgh, Scotland, and is usually tucked in the corner of a coffee shop, dreaming up monsters. Her next YA novel, Gallant, will be released in March 2022. We are also joined by Leigh Bardugo, who is the New York Times bestselling author of Ninth House and the creator of the Grishaverse, which spans the Shadow and Bone trilogy, now a Netflix original series, and more to come. Her short stories can be found in multiple anthologies, including the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. Leigh grew up in Southern California and graduated from Yale University. These days, she lives and writes in Los Angeles. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hello.
Hello.
Awkward silence.
I know.
Oh, technology.
Oh, technology.
Yeah.
Hello, my beautiful ladies.
Hello. I'm so excited to be doing this.
Yeah, I've already told you how good it is to see your faces. So
I know this is the problem. We got our small talk out of the way before.
And now we have nothing to say to each other at all.
That's it. Goodbye.
Well, look, there's like wonderful questions filling in, and we're going to kind of pick at those, I think, as we go through, and then as well as having time toward the end, just because I want to make sure that we get to all of these marvelous questions. But I want to start out taking the moderator helm here for a minute. And I really want to talk about magic, or at least like the supernatural element, because I know, terrible. Really just into that realism. Leigh's already turning the tables on the whole talk here. But no, I noticed this common thread looking at Ninth House and at Orquídea Divina and at Addie LaRue is that we're not dealing with magic out there in a world we can't touch. It's a supernatural element that's laid directly on top of our world and inextricable from it. And I want to, that's my jam, my like kink, my whole thing is like magic that makes me believe that reality isn't quite real. Magic that makes me doubt the veracity of my reality. Like these are my favorite things.
I love that you said kink, like you're just a pervert for magic. And I think we are born wired that way. Like, and you can't get rid of it. You're just like once you get that. I don't know what's happening over there.
There's a mosquito in my Airbnb that has been eating me up. And speaking of kinks, mosquito kink. It's a were mosquito. And I'm sorry, I've derailed this completely. That's what's happening.
So gross. Yeah. One of the things I think it's sort of fascinating because there's always this desire to categorize the fantasy, and okay, this is magical realism, Orquídea, and then I don't know what you'd call Addie, because it's like you get your magic early, and and then you have your curse early, and you have it, and then the rest of the world is pretty much the world as we know it. And the ninth house is just a lot of fucked up rituals. So like I'm always curious about the labels that get ascribed to these things. But for me, like this is my favorite thing too, is because it's what we were promised when we were kids, you know, that magic was real and you just had to walk through the right wardrobe or, you know, speak the right magic words and you would have access to this secret world.
Absolutely. I think that that's such an interesting point. I think that, you know, as kids, we're told to believe in things that aren't real, monsters, Santa Claus, leprechauns, the Easter Bunny, and things. People basically like magical creatures that leave us presents, but expect us to not go with them. Like, don't trust strangers except for the people who give you gifts. And then as adults, we're stripped away of that magic. But when I was 10 years old, I wrote in my diary, which was covered in Spice Girls lollipop stickers, "Dear diary, I am now a Wiccan." And I
Wait,
can't tell
how old were you, Z? When you
10.
That's not surprising to me.
I was 10 and I was like, I'm changing my religion to Wicca because like I like, even at 10 years old, I was like, I like the ritual of the Catholic Church, but this is just like, oh, doesn't make sense to me. So now I'm a witch. And it was probably because I wanted something that was more magical. And I'm still that way. Like I'm still searching for the magic in something to what is like a magical life.
I mean, that's a great question though too, what the line between magic and superstition and faith are, you know, like, and sort of where we draw those lines. And because as a Jew, when you're like, I wanted something more magical, I was like, my dude, Jesus came back from the dead. That is magical.
Right.
Like that is peak. Like, you know,
it's like a Jew, a witch, and a pagan walk into a bar here. We're all like, well, let me introduce you to my corner. All right. We've got trees that got souls in them. Like, we got this.
Got them.
We got this.
I can water to wine, you know, there's stuff there.
I'd be curious to know how you think that sort of early exposure to faith and to rejecting faith informed Orquídea, because that's in there. Like, that's all in there.
Yeah. So in Orquídea Divina, for those of you who are just tuning in and don't know anything about this book, it's about here's a Target sticker. It's about a woman who on the day of her death, she calls her family back to their homestead to give them an inheritance. The inheritance is this magical thing that they've never understood, and they don't know whether it's real or not until 7 years later, after this passing, their family begins to get killed off, and 3 descendants have to figure out why, and they return to Ecuador. And I think that all of these questions are in Orquídea and in my work, right? What is a magical life? What does faith mean? If I do I believe in God? Do I believe in the universe? And I think that in all of my books, I have this question somehow buried in there, because it is a theme, not just in my books, but in my life, and magical realism specifically, because I am Latin American, right? I'm from the Latin American diaspora. I think that even if I had written this book and I called it fantasy, I think people would still call it magical realism because of where I come from. And because the tradition of magical realism as a literary movement was from Latin America, but this tradition exists in lots of different cultures all over the world. But because you have like 100 Years of Solitude, The House of Spirits, Borges, right? Like Borges' Labyrinth and all that stuff. You have this thing where is our existence magical? Because in the 50s in Latin America, people would just vanish. Are they vanishing because the guerrilla took them, the militia took them, or because they walked into a fairy circle or an angel came down from heaven to take them away? Like that's magical realism. And so I can't extricate that from my work, because I feel like it's just it's like in my bones as an existence.
It's funny because when I was writing up your book for my newsletter, and I was like, for fans of, and I like deliberately didn't say Isabel Allende. I was like, for fans of Alice Hoffman, I was like, because I felt like I was like, I know exactly how this has been talked about and positioned, and that is very much like no matter what label you put on it, that was bound to be the comparison that was made.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm like fascinated, I guess, by, we talk about labels, and it's interesting because there's labels applied by readership, there's labels applied by a publisher, there's labels applied by the bookstore. But like, as you kind of brought up, Leigh, like it's sometimes hard to figure out what labels we would give to our own work. Like, I'm not really sure how to, like, whenever I get asked about Addie, I'm like, I don't know. It got like immediately filtered into literary because it was more poetic. And I was like, it's still fantasy. It's just a fantasy that hugs closely. So I'd love to know, like, are there labels that you maybe that don't fit, but you wish you could apply, like things which feel less applicable in the marketing strategy, but you're like, I would call this
just vibes. I would call it just vibes.
Just vibes.
A mood.
A mood.
Zoraida Córdova, prepare for a mood.
Ninth house would be like snakes and occulty stuff, and like robes, like secret robes, and Addie would be like,
oh, you know what it is? I feel like what we're actually designing here are our candles. Like, what would your candle be? Like, that's the question. Throw out my other question. Like, what is the sense? What is the profile of the candle that is your book?
Okay, Leigh, you start.
All right, I guess mine is old books and cemetery moss and bone dust and like some very expensive cologne mixed in. It's funny because Ninth House is in some ways dark academia, right? That's what a lot of people like. That's what it is. But I'm like, at its heart, it's horror. It is very much a horror novel, and it is sort of deeply rooted in. I tend to think that like the emotional thing that powers horror stories is shame. It's not actually fear, and I think that that's the engine behind Ninth House. Behind is I'm going to frighten you, but I'm going to frighten you with the real world as opposed to all these imagined monsters. But okay, let's hear it. Let's hear the delicious candles that I can't wait to buy on.
Yeah. I think mine would be what's that word for like the smell after it rains? Petrichor.
Petrichor. Yeah.
Petrichor.
All the writers are like,
yeah, we know that
word. Whiskey. A very lush garden, obviously orchids, Stardust. Does the Stardust have a smell? It does now.
What does Stardust smell like?
It smells like cake. Everybody knows that. Yeah.
Everybody.
Sheet cake,
yeah. And I think a little bit of like rot, like mulch, like a garden that is dying.
Yeah.
Rot. Like somebody really like, this smells. Okay.
God.
That undercurrent of death.
Yeah, an undercurrent of decay.
Peak goth. Love it.
Let's see. I think Addie LaRue would probably smell of like wood shavings and champagne and wrought iron.
Ooh, that's a good smell.
Yeah, like it's just that kind of like, it smells like time, right? Like it's that sense of like when you go walking in old places, like Edinburgh has a lot of it. Anywhere that has like old stone walls, it's the smell of damp, like damp on stone, which I feel is super different from petrichor, but it's like the smell of like, it's the almost pleasant smell of age.
Do you know that company Black Phoenix Alchemy Labs? Yes. I'm just saying.
Yeah, they like curate.
Curate
scents.
Create a beautiful array.
Yeah, so next time you walk into a bookstore, be thinking about what candles you want to buy. Think of it like a candle. But I do think that's important too, because of these undernotes that we're talking about is what we're really talking about here. Like these overnotes are the things, the way in which our books get actually marketed. But the undernotes are so much what's important to the author. This undernote of horror, of the like the danger element, the undernote of rot, the undernote of like almost the sadness of decay. These are the notes that I feel like we're bringing that are less marketable, less like some ability to sum up.
Well, they're sort of Trojan horse books, right? Like I'm going to tell you this beautiful story, this sprawling family saga about magic, but I'm also going to tell you all about oppression and about what it means to struggle as an artist. Or I'm going to tell you about a girl who makes a deal with the devil, but I'm also going to tell you what it means to be a woman trying to make her mark in the world over centuries. Like I don't actually know the story I really am setting out to tell until it's told. You know, I always say I have a popcorn sensibility. I'm like very Michael Bay. I'm going to push it up and there's stuff going to happen. There's going to be an amazing twist. And but in the act of telling a story honestly, you invariably go places you didn't expect to go. And the story kind of reveals itself to you.
Totally. I've never sat down with the theme in mind, like the theme, like the motif, like I have certain ideas, but it's really not until I reach the end of a draft that it's like, oh, well, that's what my subconscious was playing while my conscious was playing this.
Yeah.
I agree with that. It actually took me, I think this book took me like 7 drafts. And I think that I don't discover the true heart of the book until 7th. I come in with an idea, an image, and a character, but thematically, like it reveals itself to you.
So who did you start with? Was it Orquídea who was like?
I started with the image of Orquídea. Yeah, with the image of her like death day, basically. Because it started off as a short story, and I just had this recurring image, and I worked backward. Okay, there's this image of this woman alone in this valley. Why is she in this valley? How did she end up here? Why does she have to call her descendants back? Why does she have to? Why aren't they there in the first place? Why did everyone leave? What is she running from? And I think that's how I create characters, from asking questions, finding a starting point, and then asking questions that will lead me back to wherever the story started.
Yeah, I think the good ideas are the ones that won't stop asking you questions, that keep you open. Yeah.
I think a lot of, so many craft talks go into the method behind it, but I feel like so often it really just does start with, for me, it's always what if. It's always just because I think what if is a question that hinges on realism, because you start with a basis of reality and then ask what if X was different. So instead of almost conjuring from whole cloth, it's like you stand in a real place and then say, okay, here's what is, but what if I could do this instead? And I feel like those questions, that's how something sinks teeth into you, right? That's like, to your point, like, yeah, I think so many people don't realize, like, authors, you sit with a story, like Z, you said 7 drafts, like you sit with it for years, you sit with it for so much more time before it will ever become onto like readers' consciousness, right? And in order for it to stay, Addie took 10 years, and it was because I couldn't stop asking. I would love to have not written it because it was hard and it scared me, but it just kept coming back. Well,
I think, I always say that because people are so fascinated with where did the idea come from. And even as a writer, I love that question. Like I love to hear where the genesis began, what was the thing that sort of grabbed hold of you. But I think there's this myth that writing a book is about falling in love with this grand idea, when really it's about staying in love. Like it's easy to fall in love and be like, this is sexy, I like it. And it's much tougher when the magic and the moonlight wear off to walk away and be like, that other idea looks a lot hotter right now. So it's really about staying, committed and in it and finding ways to fall back. And I never know when I'll fall back in love with a story.
I always say, I'd love to hear, that love story, because for me, it's like, I'm in love with the idea at its very inception, and I don't fall back in love until the polish at the very end, where I read it as a reader instead of the writer, like where I start to forget that I wrote it. Everything in between is like a marriage that I'm not sure I want to be in anymore. Like the whole space between.
We're fighting.
Yeah,
yes, we're fighting.
It's not great. Z, were you in love with it the whole time?
No, I'm not in love with any of my books the whole time. I reach a point in the middle where I'm like, why did I do this? Why am I a writer? What is the point? And then friends like Danielle and you yell at me.
Yeah.
And I remember I fall back in love into the story. And I've never had a moment where I didn't fall back in love with the story. But I also think that from the minute you start, like the inception of a story and conception of a story, and then when you get to the end, you're like a different person, because if this process takes, Orquídea Divina took me 3 years to, like, from start to finish, 3 years. And it's the longest a book has ever taken me. And I think that I was a different person every time I went back to that draft. And so that changes how you're writing the story, hopefully for the better, if you're working on personal growth.
What's that?
I'm just in a perpetual slow downward spiral. So definitely in a different place. Yeah.
It's fine. It's fine.
That's fine. Should we take a question? We have like 22 of them.
Oh my goodness.
Well, this kind of ties directly in, going from like the most asked down. Well, just swap. But you know what? We're going to get to both of them, which is, how long do your stories sit in your head before they come out into writing? I mean,
Wow.
Ninth House.
I mean, Ninth House has been cooking since I was an undergrad, you know, like that was and I will candidly say it was the first idea I pitched to my agent after I signed with her. I signed with her based on Shadow and Bone, and then she said, you know, what else are you interested in writing? And I was like, I have this idea, but we didn't know where it fit at the time. And I did not have the cred to just launch myself into adult from nowhere. So it took a long time to figure out where that book belonged. And I think it also, like, the market was primed. Like, I know we all want to just talk about the book of our heart and the magic of writing, but the fact is you've got to sell it. You know, a publisher has to be willing to take a gamble on it. And you have to find the right editor who's willing to say, I know this book isn't for everyone, but I'm willing to put it out there for the people that it is for. But I think that books like The Magicians and Discovery of Witches sort of created a space in the market that hadn't existed before for this kind of book. But I didn't know any of that was going to happen. I was busy, you know, fulfilling my contracts and trying to get all the stories out of my head.
Yeah.
Because I've been working on contract nonstop since 2012, I don't sit with a story for too long. I think I give myself a lot of breathing room, but I don't time it. It could be a couple of weeks, it could be a few months. I've had an idea that I've been ruminating on for since the beginning of the summer, and it's fine. Like, it's slowly been building, and I've been trying to find an entry point into the story. And then I have other ideas that I've been thinking about for years, but I need to wait for either an entry point or until I feel like I'm skilled enough to tell that story. Like, the story feels so big that I'm like, I don't know if I'm a good enough writer to write it yet, and I want to do a good job.
But I feel like that's always the hint that you're doing the right thing. Like, when you feel like, I don't know how, that's when you know you're doing something different and bigger and better than what you've done before. But I also feel like it's like you're creating like a social club in your head, you know, where all the ideas go, and the right ideas have to, this is a very like COVID conversation I'm having. I'm like, and you meet this idea and that idea. Who knows who you might meet if you're ever allowed to leave the house. But I think for me, that's like a weird part of the process, is that sometimes it's about two little bits of things coming together and saying, oh, that was the way this puzzle was supposed to fit all along.
Yeah. I also think it's important to remember, I mean, like, you're never ready to write that story. You don't really get ready until you've written it. Like, by the time you finish writing it, you will have been ready to write. I mean, but I understand that fear. I mean, that fear kept Addie in a box in my head for the first 5 of 10 years, was like, I'm not ready to write it. But I do think, yeah, I've had stories sit for, I have a long cook time in general. I've had stories sit for as little as like 6 months to a year, but often for me, it's several. Like, I always give people the context for Addie LaRue is that I had the initial idea before my very first novel, The Near Witch, was published, like before it hit shelves. And Addie is my 20th novel. So like that sat for a very long time. And I think it didn't suffer for it. Like, I'm glad that it sat. And I think that's one of the hardest things to measure is like, when does it become an excuse? Because about 7 years in, it became an excuse to let it sit. Like I was ready to write it. And my excuse was like, oh, I need to be ready. And I'm not, when the truth was like, at that point, I was just afraid.
I do remember being about halfway through 6 of Crows and being like, this is a great book and somebody smarter needs to write it. You know? Because I was like, I really felt like you are learning on the job. Like if you're pushing yourself at all, if you're not just writing the same thing again and again, you're learning on the job, and that's terrifying. It's a high wire.
It's scary. It's every now and then I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if I did the same thing twice? Because that's the only thing I know I can do, but it's the only thing I have no interest in doing. So, I mean, I'm going through that with Threads now, like with my next series, which is a continuation of an existing series. And it's like, oh, I genuinely had the exact same thought the other week where I was like, I don't think I'm smart enough to write this. Like, why did I ever want to write an epic fantasy? I don't feel smart enough. Like, I went from 2 standalone novels into like back into a trilogy. And I was like, what am I doing here? I would be so much happier. But the whole time I was writing a standalone, I was like, I miss my series.
Yes.
Grass is greener. All right, let's do another question from the bunch.
I really like this top one. What are you loving right now? Because I want to preface it with that, like, obviously we get asked a lot, like what books we're loving and things like that. And that's a fine way to answer. But like after 1.5 years of everything that we've been through, I feel like I've called this like a time of small joy. And like, you know, we don't really get a huge amount of big joy in the landscape right now, aside from an incredible book release. And so like, I want to know, like, you can give big answers too, but I kind of want to know your small answers.
Oh God.
I don't know. I mean, for me, like, it's like a personal thing. Like I'm in California right now. And so I'm really loving reconnecting with like friends that I haven't seen in 1.5 years, and hiking, even though it's 1,000,000 degrees, and just finding little moments to work on what's going to be my next stories, right? Like finding those little moments. As far as books, I'm loving right now I'm reading Saint by Sierra Simone, which is about a monk who goes on a road trip with his ex-boyfriend, and they fall back in love.
Jam.
Sounds good. As far as what I'm reading, I'm only reading research right now. I'm in the middle of Ninth House 2.
Is it called 10th House?
Oh my God! I have heard it so many times. I'm coming to your apartment. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Although weirdly, I did this whole thing where I was like, "Oh, guys, the title to the sequel is in the last chapter, la di da," and then I'm like, "I'm changing the title." This other title just like popped into my head, and I was like, "That's what I want." And so right now I'm reading a book called Visions of Hell Before Dante. It's dry, not very interesting, and you know, other things I'm loving. We adopted a dog, Freddie, who is a tremendous joy, but also a pain in the butt. He's got a lot of, I don't know what his life was before they found him as a stray. And I really wish he could talk. Because I'm like, where did you get these hangups? Like he right now he's made his first dog friend because he hated other dogs. And I was like, oh, I managed to adopt an introvert. But yeah, and we've had a few rainy mornings that have been complete heaven after this long hot summer of drought. And I actually have done some cooking this summer from these Sephardic cookbooks that my friend found, and that has been this sort of cool way of connecting with this other part of my history and my family. Like I'm missing half of my family tree. So family tree, oh my God, Z.
I'm missing my family tree like right before my grandparents. Like I have no idea, you know.
That's the nature of diaspora, right? Like that's like it means that you're missing these parts of knowledge and heritage. And I think food is sort of an incredibly cool way to to connect with those things, and I'm not a cook. So it requires all of my attention and focus on a recipe, and that for me is actually a fantastic way to relax because I can't be thinking about other things. I have to only be doing the task that's at hand.
I love that. I'm just thinking about the fact that my dad, I was with my parents for like 16 months during the pandemic. And my father, who is like willfully disconnected from his immediate family, which means it's kind of like severed that tree, like a little lightning strike. We went on a kind of a classic musical kick and we watched Fiddler on the Roof. And for some reason that, and not 72 years on this earth, made my father like because my family are Russian Jews, and like they basically, he like needed to go down this loop where suddenly he was like emailing all members of his family to try and find out, because like exactly when they would have like emigrated and like fleeing the, I don't know, but I just think it's so funny that like I have begged my entire life for my father to try and like create his family tree for me because he's so disinterested. He like just disowned himself because of family drama, as you do. And but like this, like watching a musical made him like, I need to know. What if this was us? Like, I need to know.
I just need to point out that did anybody see I'm not gonna ask if anybody saw Jungle Cruise, but did you see the ads with The Rock in his little vest and his cap? Because he looks exactly like Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. Like the first time I saw him, I was like, if I were a rich man.
I just could not believe I have begged for 34 years on this earth for my father to try and do a little research. And like this was, I was like, oh, but
you should have just broken it.
Like seriously? And anyway, my small joy right now is like I'm back in Edinburgh for the first time in 17 months in my home, and I live a couple blocks from the sea, and it's the North Sea, and it's deeply cold, like very cold. And I've started swimming in it every week. Like, and it is the most magical, it's probably about 50 degrees. So you don't do it for a very long time. And it is the most incredible experience.
I'm just imagining all these Scottish people being like, what's that crazy American?
No, this is the thing though. The people do it. Like I'm not, it's not like I'm alone in the bay. Like people are out there in like swim shorts.
As somebody who has lived in Puerto Rico for the last 7 months and been in an ocean that is like a nice 72, 80.
No, you can't come.
Like,
you can't go in this water.
I can't imagine it. I've been to your
this way. It's actually been like a deeply. It's almost hard to explain. Like, yeah, it has a very cult-like following, swimming in cold water, and I now understand why. Which is like, my parents ask me every single week, like, why. And the thing is, it's because when you first step in, like you have to make the choice to go in and it's a tide. And so you are like willfully submerging yourself farther and farther, and it's cold. And at first you think, I can't do this. And then you do, and you do it a little more and a little more. And then by the time you get out, the air outside is warmer than the water inside. And so you don't feel cold anymore. You just feel like this incredible euphoric ability to have done it. And I think there might be a metaphor for writing books in there.
Is that hypothermia?
Word on that?
It's not hypothermia. It's not hypothermia. It's not.
I don't feel my toes anymore. What's happening?
Just because my hands are cold for the rest of the day, it's not hypothermia, but there's something to be said there. Okay, somebody else pick a question because I get daunted.
You do it. Please. This is your day.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, hold on. Let's see. What are some tips you have for being more disciplined about writing and not writing just when you feel inspired? And I think that we can all say, this is Andrea Magaña's question. I think that we all have this approach where, we're all contracted authors. So sometimes we can't wait for inspiration. So I'd love for us to talk about that.
Yeah. I text Zoraida and Danielle Clayton, our mutual friend, basically being like, I can't do it. I'm going to quit and move to Iceland and raise goats. At which point Zoraida and Danielle are like, no, you're going to do it because you always do it. This is just where we are.
I would like to point out that I do encourage you to go so that I can go with you.
Yes.
Sometimes when I'm a bad friend.
I have to believe that there are challenges to goat herding in Iceland.
Well, I'm sure. People tell me.
One way you'd be like, I'm quitting and I'm going to go write novels. So
there you go. Look.
Grass is greener.
The grass is greener.
Always.
Literally. So, okay. Being more disciplined. So for me, I have learned that I cannot write before noon. I can wake up. I've been waking up at 7 o'clock in the morning because my body was jet lagged, and now it's just my new schedule. But I still can't write. That's the time I make my coffee, I make my breakfast, I sort of prepare myself, like warming up a car, right? I do all my administrative work, so I answer emails and check in with my agent or editor if I need to. And then after that, I can write. And I think that I wasted so much time trying to be like one of those 5 o'clock in the morning authors, with my cup of coffee and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, that's not me. And I think learning the kind of author that you are helps with that discipline and figuring that out. Because if you're a night owl, you're just not going to write in the day. And if you're, what's it called, a morning lark, you're not going to write after dinner.
What's that word for a morning person?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of ways to respond to this question, right? And I think that yours is the most valuable, because the toughest part, I think, of becoming a writer and a working writer is finding your process. And that's not just about finding, do you outline, do you not outline, how do you outline? It's also about what you do every day. And there have been periods of time and books where I was one of those, I'm going to get 1,500 words out a day. That's the way this is going to be. But I've also had books where I would work in spurts of tremendous creativity and energy, and then I would need to refuel and step away from the story for a week. And I think that, in terms of becoming more disciplined, in some ways you've got to treat it like a job. And you should ask yourself, what's keeping you away from the page? Is it fear? Is it not knowing where the story goes? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? When you sit down, we all fear that moment. And the greatest cure for that is every day when you leave off, end with a question. This is, what happens. It can't be what happens next, but it can be, pose a question that your subconscious can be working on, or say the next scene I'm going to write is X, Y, Z, and, finish in a way that allows you runway the next day to keep going and keep your momentum. The great secret of being disciplined, I think, is maintaining momentum, not allowing yourself to go research things every other minute, not being distracted by social media. That momentum is precious, and you sort of work to preserve it at all costs.
I also think it's perfectly valid here's the thing. I'm on my 22nd book, and every single day when I sit down, and I'm the opposite of Z in that, if I don't write something in the morning, I have a very hard time making myself write something in the afternoon. The longer my day goes on without words on the paper, the more excuses I have for not starting that day. But every single day when I sit down to try and make some words, I have probably a 5-minute, oh shit, I don't want to get in this water, right? To use my sea metaphor, I have a visceral, no matter how excited I was the day before to write this next scene, there is almost a visceral hurdle that I have to overcome to begin writing that day. And that should not be mistaken for lack of momentum. That's just cracking the seal on that day. And sometimes what I'll do is I use a Pomodoro method on my phone, but I'll set a 10-minute timer instead of a 30-minute timer. And I'll just spend 10 minutes just brainstorming, not even writing, just cracking the mental seal and reminding myself that I like this.
This is okay. That's important. Okay. It's so important because it's so easy to get bogged down in, I did this a lot when I was working on Roll of Wolves. I would remind myself, you actually like this job. Yes, it's a job, but you actually like this and you're actually good at it. And that is important because the business of this and the work of this can begin to feel onerous, and that can take away the pleasure that we all want from the work. But it's also, I can't speak to people who throw themselves into the ICC, but an athlete does not, when they are going to go work out of their sport, they don't just throw themselves in. They warm up, they stretch. That is part of the process as you begin your work every day. And sometimes for me, the only thing that works is to say, I don't know what to write. I was so excited to write the scene, but now I feel completely unable to work. I'm frozen. Or I know that the scene needs to be X, Y, or Z, and that sort of breaks the paralysis between your brain and your hands, which is a real physiological thing that happens, a big part of writer's block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember which author. It might have been Donna Tartt, though I feel like she gets mythologized, so things probably get attributed. Who, like, if you write by hand, for instance, just like even scribbling across the top of the page, doing something to show yourself that this is not a precious space. To your point, even if it's writing, like, I don't know what I'm going to write. For me, it's like I will try and write one sentence within that scene that I'm excited by. Maybe the sentence falls in the middle of the scene, but I know there's a moment, and I write that. And all of a sudden, once I have a moment on that page, it's like, oh, I remember how to do this.
You write out of order, and it just
I know.
Like I don't.
It's okay. I know. It's so that if I die, no one will ever be able to assemble my books. What if they're not done?
This is the opposite of what I want. I was on a plane for the first time in a year and a half, and I was like, oh my God, if I die, what will, who will finish? But I'm like, there's an outline. Somebody will take care of it.
It's titled 10th House. It's on my computer. Definitely follow that. I'm just going to make
a list of all the people I don't want to write it. And
there you go. I love it.
Oh, dear.
I have a question here from Christian, my bud. How do you approach creating characters for your books?
With a mallet. It depends. It depends. There's not one method for me. I know there are people who create profiles and histories and so forth. That's not really my point of access. I think most of my characters begin as tropes. They begin as people with a particular quirk or a job to do. An archetype, a job to do, when it came to Alex in Ninth House, I wanted to create somebody who was a kind of ultimate underdog, because the problem with college stories is that the stakes are inevitably very low. So I wanted the stakes to be up really high, and I wanted her to be threadless. I wanted her to be disconnected from all the things that can sort of give us a sense of security. So I knew I wanted to snip away at her familial relations, her past, her relationship to culture, her relationship to religion, in order to isolate her as much as possible. But then there are characters, in an ensemble piece like Six of Crows, there were certain characters who showed up speaking loud and clear immediately, like Matthias, and then there were and Nina took a long time to land, and it was a particular scene. You find a particular line and all of a sudden you think, oh, there she is. Do
you remember which one it was?
Yes. I remember very clearly. There was, in the first draft, the sort of skeleton draft, she was very boring. She just hadn't arrived. And there's a scene where Kaz comes to essentially not dupe, but lure her into this heist, and she's eating a piece of cake, and there's crumbs on her cleavage, and she toes her slippers off. She's just exhausted, and he says, you have crumbs on your cleavage, and she's like, I don't care. And I was like, there's my girl. There she is.
I love that.
So,
and you wouldn't think that because she's so strong. She's such a strong character on the page, and you know what my ship is, so you think it.
But I have many ships, Aziz. Let's be honest. The more doomed, the better for this woman.
I know. But okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say, I think everybody has a different starting point. And I think it's important to remember that the act of writing is sitting with discomfort, and I knew she wasn't where she needed to be, but you keep going until you get to the place where, you land. You're not going to get there only by sitting and stewing. Sometimes it's about walking away, going for a swim in the icy sea. I'm just going to keep.
I know, it's fine. I will own it.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, I have no doubt that at some point you've been, splashing about, and all of a sudden your brain says, "Oh, I have the answer for you." That's just the way.
That's true. It's absolutely true. That's something just clicks, and I hate saying that because, that's not the answer that people want to hear. There's no secret sauce or actual method, right? There's a moment where you get this perfect sentence or this perfect twist, and it's the inactive part of your brain, the inactive part of writing, which Victoria, you talk about all the time, right? Like thinking is writing and walking is writing, and like the things that you should that you're not the active act of writing is not it. and for creating characters, I should probably know this since I'm teaching a class on it on Lit Reactor right now. But I tell people that the finding out about your characters is finding out about their surroundings, because you have to see not just how your character is impacting the story and moving the pieces along, but how has this actual world impacted your character, all of their hopes and fears and bruises and these things, especially like with marginalized people, right? Like you're not going to walk through the world the same way another character would. And so thinking about the exterior world and the politics, the geography, everything about it, whether it's fantasy or contemporary, all of that impacts who this person is and the choices that they're going to make throughout the story.
Yeah, they don't float. People don't float, right? Like we don't float on top of the world. We walk within it. And I feel like you can tell when characters feel like they're
plunge
floating.
into the
We plunge into the icy sea of our world. No, but I'm actually like sitting here thinking of like, I probably wouldn't have had an answer at the beginning of this, because I think that the characters are one of those murky places. But I'm now thinking to both of your points, Leigh, like when I'm getting to know a character, it's through a specific scene. Like I reduce characters to a mantra when I'm first creating them. Like, what do I want their guiding principle to be? Because then you can challenge it and make them break it and reform it. But when I'm getting to know my characters, what makes them feel like people instead of ideas is the context of a scene that defines them in some way. And like, I will never forget that the very first scene I ever thought of for Shades of Magic was Kel walking through a wall and colliding with Lila. And she's dressed as a boy and she robs him. And this collision defined both of them. This collision, how they behaved in that moment summed up everything I needed to know about my entry point into that world. And I'll think like, even when I was thinking of Addie LaRue, it was always how Addie behaved in one moment in history. What was the moment? What did it look like? And so I think trying maybe not to think of characters as if, to both of your points, as if they exist outside of a world. You're writing your characters inside of a world. So what does it look like when they interact with that world? What does the interaction mean to them? What does normal mean to them? And what does strange mean to them? And like, what does a quintessential them moment inside that life look like?
You know, this is funny because we've all written young adult and people always ask me, what makes something young adult? Why young adult? And I think that part of it is how the fact that it is the first moment where you really yourself and the world come into conflict. Yeah. Where the person where you begin to create friction with your surroundings. And you just described a scene that is literally about conflict and collision. Yeah. So I think that those moments of friction, when your character is bumping up against the rules of your world, and by rules, I don't mean like the way the magic works, but it can, but it's also simply the way the culture works, the way gravity works, how are they impacted by these things as they move through the story?
Yeah. This is the thing I love about talking to both of you. Is like, now I feel inspired. I'm like, what is what is the defining scene and the thing I'm working? Like, now I want to go to work, and it's unfortunate that it's like almost midnight here. I'm not going to. I've been drinking whiskey, but like, I do now feel inspired to that. I feel
voice notes.
Yeah, exactly. Lying in bed tonight, I'm like, remember what Leigh and Z said. And then tomorrow I'll be like, it was really good. What was it? No, but I do think it's really good to talk about these in the sense of the groundedness, because I do think these things get mythologized. Like, oh, you'll know the character as a person when they speak to you. I'm like, I don't think I'm grateful for it, but it's not the norm for me. Most of the time I'm like prying details out of their lives.
I think we have to treat all of these, everything is revision, right? Everything is revision. And some characters will show up whole cloth and speak to you, and others will not. And there are just pieces, a draft is where you're telling yourself the story. And you said you're getting to know the character. That is exactly what that first draft is for. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes writers think that ideas, books, plots, magic systems, characters arrive whole cloth, and they simply don't.
Yeah, that's actually that. We have a couple of questions that are about like rewriting and second drafts, and Wellington and Daisy here. They're like, what's the process of editing? Which I think kind of goes with like what's the first thing you do when you're checking your second draft? And I think that for me, I start off with a very, like, my editor's probably here and the comments are off, so she can't be like, I'm here, I'm listening to you. My first draft for Orquídea was like 35,000 words long, and it was literally a skeleton draft, because I had that moment where I'm like, I can't put on the page the Michelangelo painting that I see in my brain. And the thing is, like, you don't have to, because there are stages. And like, Victoria, you have that beautiful
I was going to say,
about building a body, because you're a morbid thing. So I let you talk about that, because I agree with it.
Well, no, it's weird that I have two metaphors for this. One of them is more depressing than the other. So I'll use the body metaphor because it's less depressing. That I feel like, I used to put makeup on first on my book. I used to be really attached to my prose. Like, I would, as I was writing a first draft, I would agonize over every word of it. But that's like putting makeup on a corpse that has no bones. Like, it's really not going to sit very well. Like, you don't have the body. And so for me, like, you need to have a skeleton. That's your plot. And then you need to have the meat and the tissue and the skin. These are the layers. These are all the pieces. And then the finesse, the clothing and the makeup and the things, the way you decorate your corpse, those are the final touches. And if you put your makeup on your corpse, that's fine. But then when you go to revise it, when you go take the body apart again, you've ruined all your makeup. You're going to have to do it all over again. So now I work in stages where I build a skeleton for myself. And then the act of writing that first draft is just getting kind of the shape of the body down. And then the courses of revision for me are like sculpting it and making it look like an individual. And then
we all just Dr. Frankenstein.
I mean, it's funny you say Frankenstein, because that's what I was going to say. I think I have a more Frankenstein approach depending on the book. Like, with all the Grishaverse books, with most of my books, that is exactly the process. Skeleton draft, get that beginning, middle, and end on. It's build a blueprint. So you don't have to take the swimming pool out of the living room. But Ninth House is different for me, and the sequel has been different too. It's much more of a Frankenstein thing, where it's like, I have a complete head, and I will sew it onto the body, and then electricity. No, I don't know where this analogy is going, but it doesn't walk or talk until it's all assembled. But for me, I have to go back and retread again. It's like, it's too dense for me to hold it all in state in the way that I do other stories. And I'm not sure why that is, but I do think part of the process of both writing and revision is respecting that the book is going to tell you what it wants you to do. You can fight it all you want, but the book is going to tell you, and then you're going to have to say, okay, I'm going to do something different than what I've done before.
Yeah, I think for me, specifically Orquídea Divina, I got in my head so much that I suffered through the editorial process, because in my head I was like, nobody's going to take me seriously as an adult author. People are going to call it YA anyway. And so I had to sort of separate myself from the outside world, and I just want everyone to like me, but I know that I can't control that. And the thing with writing in a new space, I was too aware of the industry part of it that I let that infiltrate my thoughts of revision. And then once I went back to the third revision, I was like, okay, I no longer care anymore. I'm having a better mental health day. So let's attack this draft as with a different question, which is like, why are we here? Why am I telling these people's stories? Why do they matter? And attacking the revision in that way really cleared things up for me for this book.
I'm actually want to go back to your book for just a second.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, and Ray.
Yeah.
And the idea, I mean, can you talk a little bit about art and curses and magic and why that character evolved into what he evolved into?
Yeah, so Ray is short for Raymundo, who is one of the cousins in Orquídea Divina. And he, when they get their gift, their inheritance from their grandmother, his is involving art. And the last thing she tells him is they're talking about a painting, like the only painting he's ever painted. And he's always wanted to do it, but he forced himself to stop because he associated the minute that he started working on his art, his mom died, right? And Latinos were superstitious, so he's like, this is why I can't paint again. And so the only thing his grandmother says is, paint me another. And so he goes and he sets off to do this. He goes back to college for art, and he has this fervor where the art is almost all consuming, and the art is taking over his entire life. And all of a sudden, he's not painting these beautiful. I made him paint like surrealism, because magical realism, right? And all of a sudden, he's not painting these. He's not painting the magical reality that he wanted. He's painting these dark moments, this like shadow that is plaguing him, that is watching him, and he's painting all of his fears and this external threat. And I feel like for me that is like my process as well. Or that fear sort of takes over and overpowers this thing that is supposed to be this gift.
Yeah. Completely. I feel like every author sees themselves in that character, and specifically in but all of us have written in YA and then come into adult. And I feel like there is just this intense fear anytime you step out of one zone that you've established or one space that you've inhabited into another, and felt in some way either inadequate to the task by virtue of the fact that we always feel inadequate to the task that we're plunged into, or we create a narrative that might not even exist, but we create the narrative that we believe will exist around us. And then we use that to kind of inhibit our own creativity. As you were saying, Z, like this fear of being tested, being judged, being found wanting, and I feel like that darkness that's plaguing him is the thing that plagues everyone in the pursuit of things that fear them. And there's something we also talk about, right? Which is that when you're writing the right story, just like you said at the beginning, Zoraida, it's that you don't feel up to it. That's the story, like Leigh said, that you should be writing, the one that scares you. I always know I'm on the right track with a story if I don't feel capable of writing it. If I feel scared to fail at it, that I feel like is the sign that that's the one worth pursuing. And I feel like you've given that to Ray and to yourself.
I think we all put these characters into our books deliberately. Addie is in pursuit of leaving a mark on the world, of being remembered. And what is art but the thing that lives beyond your death, and Ray has this tremendous success, but there's, a price for that, and what drives our creativity, what consumes us versus feeds us. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious thing, but I think that process of continuing to work in a world that doesn't necessarily value what you do, or the things that you value about what you do, becomes a part of every story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh man, better make it a good one.
You pick it, Victoria.
Don't put that. Why would you put that on me?
Why would you put that on me?
I like a
No. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to end it with the hardest question possible. Do you have a go-to writing snack?
Look, okay. I will tell you this.
Yeah.
Whatever is in the damn house. Especially if I'm on deadline, everything goes to hell. At one point, I have a very clear memory. I don't remember what book I was working on, but I remember eating a hard-boiled egg and a pineapple ring. And I was like, everything about this is disgusting, but it will nourish me as I move forward into whatever I need to do next. And I used to keep a bag of raw broccoli by my laptop because I was like, healthy snacking. I'll eat the healthy snack while working thing. And then I came back from one of my idea walks.
Yeah.
And I went in the bathroom and I realized I had broccoli in my hair. And
it was a very Nina moment.
Met my neighbors. Hello. But I like it. I think it adds to my neighborhood eccentric thing. So it's fine.
It builds character. Yeah. I think I need coffee, but I don't snack usually because I don't like having dirty keyboard. So I make myself eat before and after. There's always wine.
Always wine.
Food is definitely my break time. Mostly because I think if you write professionally or if it takes up part of your work day, to me, I need a break, and I need to multitask that break. And so the break and the food, these things happen together, and the coffee and the tea consumption, these things happen while typing. But if I can get my hands on like some cookies, like some tea biscuits, those can live with me in that space. But I have to like ration them, because I go into this fugue state where like whatever is in reach will disappear.
Yeah. I also love to just eat jam from a jar. And I would just stand there, Joey on Friends is basically.
Yes. Yeah.
None of these foods are snacks. I'm eating like popcorn and like peanuts. You're like, here's some broccoli florets and a jam jar.
I said, it is whatever is in the.
One time when I was editing The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, and it was 4 a.m, and I had a deadline later, like that day, and I started eating espresso beans. I just started chewing on coffee beans.
At which point her heart just hummingbird right out of her chest.
That day I was literally seeing shapes move in the wall, and then I passed out for 20, and I was useless for 4 days.
So there's your options, kids.
Keep it healthy. Good choices.
Self-destructive authors.
All right.
Well, thank you all for this wonderful conversation. It's been really great to listen to. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight and supporting independent bookstores, especially in these times. It's so important. And don't forget that you can purchase The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina on our website by clicking the green button below. And just thank you guys all again for this wonderful conversation. And thank you everyone who joined. It was great.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.